Good evening. Find a comfortable position. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears, and let the room around you go quiet for a while. Wherever you are tonight, whatever the day has asked of you, you have arrived somewhere gentler. Dim the lights a little if you can. Pull whatever is over you a little higher, and let your hands rest, palms open, doing nothing at all. Tonight, we are going somewhere small and warm and very specific. Not a battlefield. A workroom on the second floor of a narrow brick house in Mayfair, London, the spring of 1905, where a group of women have spent the day building beautiful things out of silk and thread and patience, and where, as the light goes long and gold through tall windows, there is a certain kind of quiet that settles over a place at the end of skilled work. You may know it yourself if you have ever finished something with your hands. A garden bed, a good meal, a piece of furniture sanded smooth. It is the quiet of a task completed well, and it is, I think, one of the most restful sounds a person can sit inside. That is the sound we are going to spend the next few hours listening to. We will meet a woman who has given her whole working life to a needle and a length of cloth, and we will follow her through a single ordinary day, because the ordinary days are where a life actually happens. We will learn what her hands knew that her employers never troubled to write down. We will learn what a length of silk cost against what she earned to sew it. We will sit with her in the last hour of daylight as the workroom empties out, and we will climb the stairs with her afterward to a small room that was entirely her own, which was, in 1905, no small thing for a woman of her position to have. You do not need to remember any of it. There will be no test at the end of this, only an evening spent somewhere real in the company of someone who worked hard and noticed things, which is, in the end, most of what any of us manage to do with our one life. So settle in properly. Now let the mattress or the cushion take your full weight. We have some time together tonight. Nowhere else to be. Tonight, we are going to spend a full day inside the working life of an Edwardian dressmaker's workroom in the London season of 1905 through the eyes of one woman who has spent 15 years learning a trade most people alive today. There is a comfortable version of this story, and there is an honest one. The comfortable version is the one you have probably absorbed without ever quite choosing to. Genteel women in high collars, bent prettily over embroidery hoops in a sunlit parlor, sewing as a pleasant accomplishment between piano lessons and afternoon calls. It is a lovely picture. It is also almost nothing like what actually happened behind the doors of a real West End dressmaking house. The truth is a great deal more interesting, and it involves considerably more skill than the pretty picture allows for. The women who built the gowns worn to the grandest events of the London season were not amateurs enjoying a pastime. They were tradeswomen, apprenticed as girls, promoted through a strict internal hierarchy over years, capable of cutting a bodice to fit a body they had never touched, from measurements alone, capable of setting a sleeve so it moved with the arm instead of against it. They stood for 10, 12, sometimes 14 hours during the height of the season. They earned, at their very best, a fraction of what a single evening gown cost the woman who would wear it once and forget who had made it. By the time we have finished tonight, I think you will look differently at the idea of a needle and thread. You will understand why a certain quiet pride belonged to the women in these workrooms, and why that pride so rarely made it into the history books, which tended to be written by people who never had to thread a needle by gaslight after a 12-hour day. Before we go any further, if the kind of evening you are looking for is one where history feels like a place you can actually stand inside rather than a list of dates to memorize, I would love it if you considered subscribing. It costs you nothing, and it helps this small channel keep finding its way to people who want exactly this sort of company at night. And if you feel like it, tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is there right now. I read every one, and there is something quietly wonderful about picturing all the different corners of the world where this is playing at this exact moment. Wherever you are, I am glad you came in. Now, let us step into the London of 1905, because the workroom we are visiting tonight cannot be understood apart from the city that made it necessary. It is a warm evening in May, and Mayfair smells the way Mayfair always smelled in the spring of that year, which is to say it smells of a great many things at once, layered on top of each other like the fabrics in the workroom we are about to enter. There is coal smoke, always coal smoke, rolling gently from 1,000 chimneys, even in the mild weather. Because coal fires cooked the food and heated the water and warmed the rooms of nearly every house in the city, rich or poor. Underneath that is the sharper, warmer smell of horses, because the streets are still ruled by them, hansom cabs and delivery carts, and the private broughams of women arriving for evening fittings, their hooves loud against granite sets polished smooth by decades of traffic. There is a note of fresh bread from a bakery, 2 streets over, and beneath everything, faint but constant, the green mineral smell of the Thames, 3/4 of a mile south, carrying the whole city's business down toward the sea. The spring itself has arrived late this year, London holding on to a grey, damp chill well into April, before finally surrendering to something warmer in the first weeks of May. And the change shows itself in small ways along this street. Window boxes that sat bare through the winter now hold early geraniums, tended by housemaids under instruction from mistresses, who consider a well-kept window box a small but genuine measure of a household's respectability. A blackbird has taken up residence somewhere among the chimney pots opposite and sings most evenings around this hour, with a clarity that cuts cleanly through the lower rumble of the street's traffic. Even the light itself has changed character these last few weeks, thinning and warming at once, the exact gold of a northern European spring evening that painters at the period spent whole careers failing to fully capture on canvas. The great houses of Mayfair have, for the most part, only recently reopened for the season after months spent shuttered while their owners wintered elsewhere, in the country or abroad on the continent, and their reopening sends a small ripple of extra activity through every trade that serves them. Chimneys long cold begin smoking again as fires are lit through rooms that have stood empty since the autumn. Delivery carts multiply along the street, restocking wine cellars and larders for a household about to entertain, on a scale the quieter months never demanded. And workrooms like the one above us, which might have run on a skeleton staff through February and March, fill back out to their full complement of hands almost overnight, the whole trade breathing in together as though preparing for a long-held note about to be sung. The buildings along this street are tall and narrow, 4 and 5 stories of London stock brick, gone the soft grey-brown that only decades of coal smoke can produce, their facades broken by white-painted sash windows and black iron railings guarding areas below street level where coal was delivered. Family, above this house, like most of its neighbours, wears 2 lives at once. The ground floor is a showroom, all soft carpet and gilt mirrors and a bow window dressed with a single exquisite gown on a wax mannequin, meant to draw the eye of a woman passing in her carriage. Above it, invisible from the street, is an entirely different world, a working world of long tables and gas jets and women bent over their labor from 8 in the morning until whatever hour the season's demands required. Walk a little further down this street, and the same doubled life repeats itself, house after house, though each shop wears its own small variation on the theme. 2 doors along stands a bootmaker, whose window holds a single gleaming pair of evening pumps, set on a velvet cushion. Nothing else. The emptiness of the display itself. A kind of advertisement, a way of saying that this house does not need to shout its wares to anyone worth serving. Across the street, a milliner's window is stacked with hat boxes striped like barley sugar, and beside it, a glover's shop keeps a wooden hand mannequin in white kid, fingers curled just so, forever offering a handshake to no one. Further on, where the street opens briefly into a small square, a flower seller set up her basket for the evening trade. Violets and early sweet peas bundled in damp paper, her voice carrying a soft, practiced cry that has not changed in decades. The street sounds carry differently at this hour than they did at noon. Earlier today, there would have been the cry of a muffin man, the rattle of a coal cart, the two-note whistle of the crossing sweeper clearing a path through the horse droppings for a lady stepping down from her carriage in kid boots that cost more than a seamstress earned in a fortnight. Now, as the sun drops low enough to turn the upper windows to bronze, the traffic has thinned. A lamplighter is working his way down the far side of the street with his long pole, and one by one the gas lamps bloom into pale gold circles against a sky that has not quite decided to go dark yet. This is the London season, and it governs everything about the rhythm of a street like this one. From roughly Easter until the end of July, the aristocracy and the wealthiest of the mercantile classes crowd into their London townhouses for a punishing schedule of balls, garden parties, opera evenings, court presentations, and the horse racing at Ascot. All of it requiring a fresh wardrobe that cannot be seen twice in the same circles wearing the same gown. For the great dressmaking houses of Mayfair and the streets just north of Piccadilly, the season is not simply busy. It is the entire year's income compressed into 14 or 15 weeks, and every woman working in a house like this, one knows it in her bones, in the ache of her shoulders, in the exhaustion that only comes from sustained, exacting, unforgiving work. Walk this street at 4 in the afternoon during the height of the season, and you would see the whole social machinery of the era rolling past in miniature. A closed carriage bearing a countess to a fitting 3 doors down. A pair of debutantes on foot with their mother, fresh from a dress rehearsal for their presentation at court, still discussing in low, excited voices the precise angle of a curtsy that had troubled one of them at their dancing masters that morning. A footman in livery carrying a hat box with the careful, slightly stiff gait of a man who understood that dropping it would cost him considerably more than a scolding. Beneath the surface elegance of it all ran an entire second economy that rarely appears in paintings of the period, an economy of messenger boys and delivery carts and tradesmen's entrances, of accounts kept on credit for months at a time between the grandest families, since a lady of standing was rarely expected to carry money for her own purchases at all. The whole street, in other words, was a kind of stage, and everyone on it, from the countess in her carriage to the errand girl sweeping the workroom floor 2 stories above, understood their part in the performance without needing it explained to them. The economics of this street are worth pausing over before we go inside, because they explain nearly everything that happens once we do. A skilled workman in London in 1905, a carpenter or a printer, might earn 30 to 35 shillings a week if he was fortunate enough to have steady employment. A senior seamstress in a good West End house, a woman with 15 years of training behind her, might earn something in that same range during the season, perhaps a little less, and considerably less during the quiet months of late summer and autumn when half the great houses closed their workrooms entirely. Demand returned. A room in a respectable lodging house cost perhaps 5 or 6 shillings a week. Loaf of bread cost a few pence. And the gown that a client would collect tomorrow morning, layered in tissue paper and boxed like a piece of jewelry, might cost 20, 30, in some cases, £50, more than a working seamstress would see in an entire year of steady labor. We will return to those numbers properly later tonight, because they deserve more than a passing glance. For now, simply hold them in your mind the way you might hold a stone in your pocket, a small hard fact you can touch again later. Halfway down the street, past that milliner's shop with its tower of striped hat boxes, stands the house we have come to visit. There is nothing about its exterior to distinguish it from its neighbors, except a small brass plate beside the door, polished daily by an errand girl before the shop opens, reading simply Madame Blanchard. There was no Madame Blanchard. Not really, not in the sense the plate implies. The house was built and is run by a Mrs. Constance Ashby Reeves, a widow of considerable business sense who understood, as nearly every English dressmaker of standing understood in this period, that a French name on the door added a certain unspoken authority to everything that happened behind it. Her clients knew this too, most of them, and chose not to think about it too closely, the way one chooses not to think too closely about a great many small fictions that make daily life run smoothly. The showroom windows are dark now, the day's business finished, the last client shown out an hour ago, with promises of a final fitting tomorrow before her gown is delivered for a garden party at the weekend. But if you look up past the elegant facade of the ground floor, you will see light still burning in the tall windows of the second floor, warm and steady against the darkening sky. Step through the front door for a moment before we climb any further, because the ground floor tells its own small part of this story. The showroom is hushed at this hour, carpet thick enough to swallow footsteps entirely, 3 tall gilt-framed mirrors angled, so a client could see herself from nearly every side at once, a low velvet settee where a mother might sit and watch her daughter turn before the glass. A single gown remains on display in the bow window, pale blue, silk trimmed in silver thread, chosen this week specifically because its color would catch what little evening light still reached the street. Everything down here has been arranged to suggest that beauty simply arrives, fully formed, requiring nothing so unglamorous as measurement or labor. It is only by climbing the narrow stairs at the rear of the building, the ones the clients never use, that the truth of the matter reveals itself. That is where we are going. That is the workroom, and that is where a woman named Edith Marsh is standing at this exact moment with a length of ivory silk in her hands, checking the evening light against the color one last time before it disappears entirely, because silk, more than almost any other fabric, tells the truth about itself only in daylight, and the daylight is nearly gone. Let us go up and meet her properly, because she deserves a proper introduction before we watch her work. She is not a tall woman, and 15 years of close work have left their own quiet signature on her, a slight forward set to her shoulders that no amount of straightening entirely corrects, a faint permanent groove worn into the side of her right middle finger, where a needle has pressed against the same small patch of skin thousands upon thousands of times. Her eyes are a plain grey, sharp still, despite the strain the trade has placed on them, and her hands, when she holds them still for a moment, which is rare, show the kind of steadiness that comes only from decades of controlled, deliberate movement. She is, by the plain measure of the street outside, an unremarkable-looking woman, the sort who could pass a client twice in a single afternoon without ever being properly seen. It is only when her hands are moving, cutting, or pinning, or stitching, that anyone who understood what they were watching would recognize they were looking at genuine mastery. Her name is Edith Marsh, and on this evening in May of 1905, she is 29 years old, though she carries herself, as women in her position often did, with the settled authority of someone considerably older. She is the first hand of the workroom at Madame Blancard's, which is to say she is the most senior needlewoman on the premises, beneath the forewoman herself. Entrusted with the most delicate and demanding work the house takes in. Evening gowns for presentations at court, wedding dresses for the daughters of families whose names appear in the society columns. Anything, in short, where a single crooked seam could cost the house its reputation and a client her composure on the most important day of her calendar. She was born in Bermondsey, south of the river, the second of 5 children. Her father, a cabinet maker of modest but steady employment, until a fall from a scaffold left him unable to work the last decade of his life. Her mother, taking in laundry to fill the gap his wages had left behind. Edith left home at 14 in 1890 to begin a 5-year apprenticeship at a smaller dressmaking house near Clapham, an arrangement that provided her room, plain board, and instruction in exchange for 5 years of largely unpaid labor, a common bargain of the trade and one her mother had accepted gratefully, since it meant one less mouth to feed at home and the promise, eventually, of a trade her daughter could support herself with for the whole of her working life. Those 5 years had not been easy ones. She remembers still, with a clarity that has not dulled in 15 years, the raw, split skin at the tips of her fingers during her first winter of hand-stitching heavy wool coats by cold daylight, the forewoman's sharp corrections, the deep loneliness of a 14-year-old girl sleeping in a shared attic room with 3 other apprentices, none of them older than 16, all of them equally far from their own mothers. But she had also discovered, somewhere in the 2nd or 3rd year, that her hands possessed something the other girls did not quite manage in the same measure, a natural steadiness, an eye that could see where a seam wanted to sit before the pins ever told her so. By the end of her apprenticeship she had been quietly marked out as a girl worth keeping, and when the Clapham house could not offer her advancement fast enough for her own growing ambition, she had made the considerable leap at 19 to a position as an improver at Madame Blanchard's, then a smaller and less celebrated house than it has since become. 10 years of steady work and steady promotion followed. Improver to second hand at 23, second hand to first hand at 26, a promotion that came only after the previous first hand. A woman 20 years her senior retired from the trade entirely, her eyesight finally failing beyond what even the most forgiving employer could accommodate. Edith stepped into shoes that had been worn for 2 decades by someone else, and she still, on quiet evenings, feels the particular weight of following a woman whose standards had shaped the entire workroom's sense of what good work actually looked like. She still has, folded carefully into the same drawer that holds her sister's letters, the original indenture paper her mother signed on her behalf in the winter of 1890, a formal legal document binding her to 5 years of service and instruction under the mistress of the Clapham house, witnessed and stamped. Her mother's careful signature at the bottom beside a small cross where Edith herself, then 14, and barely able to write her own name with any confidence, had been asked to make her mark. She keeps it less from sentiment, or so she tells herself, than from a habit of keeping important papers safe, though she has noticed, on the rare occasions she takes it out to look at it, that her eyes always settle first on that small childish cross, rather than on any of the formal legal language surrounding it. A reminder of exactly how young and exactly how far from home she had been when her working life properly began. She is unmarried, and likely to remain so, not for any want of proposals in her younger years, but because the arithmetic of her life never quite allowed for it. A woman of her trade who married generally left the workroom, since her husband's income was expected to support a household. The wife's needle was expected to turn toward mending his shirts rather than earning her own wage. Edith had watched 3 close friends from her apprenticeship years make exactly that choice. watched them trade the workroom for a kitchen and a row of children, and had felt, each time, a complicated mixture of gladness for them, something quieter and harder to name for herself. She had chosen the needle instead, or perhaps the needle had simply been the thing available to choose, and by 29, she had stopped weighing the decision and started simply living inside it. She lives, in fact, in this very house, in a small room on the top floor above the workroom, a privilege extended to only the most senior and trusted of the staff. Most of the other seamstresses lodge nearby, in respectable boarding houses kept specifically for young working women, walking to the shop each morning and back again each night, regardless of weather. Edith's room above the shop is both a comfort and a quiet obligation. She is, in effect, the last one in the building most evenings, the one who checks the gas is properly off, who banks the small stove in the workroom for the night, who carries the keys that Mrs. promptly are. Ashby Reeves trusts to no one else on the staff below herself. Her household, if we can call it that, is the workroom itself and the 11 other women who work within it. Beneath Edith sits a second hand named Louisa, quick and clever with her needle, but still 2 years from Edith's level of trust. Beneath Louisa, 3 more experienced hands who specialize in specific tasks, one who does nothing but sleeves and shoulders, one whose eye for trimming is considered the finest in the house, one who has spent a decade mastering the invisible stitches that hold a bodice's boning in place without a single mark showing on the outer silk. Below them, 4 improvers, young women in their late teens working through the middle years of their training. And below them, still, 2 apprentices no older than 14 girls who arrived in January with raw hands and no skill at all beyond willingness, and who by December will have learned to thread a needle in the dark from muscle memory alone. Exactly as Edith herself once did in a house across the river. Above Edith, standing between the workroom and Mrs. Ashby Reeves herself, sits the forewoman, a stern, capable widow named Mrs. Pryke, who manages the shop's order books, negotiates deadlines with clients whose expectations regularly outrun what any human hand could reasonably deliver, and holds alone among the staff the full picture of every commission moving through the house at once. Pryke and Edith have worked alongside each other for a decade, and though their relationship carries a formal distance neither woman would think to soften, a genuine respect runs underneath it, built across 100 small crises weathered together, a torn hem discovered an hour before delivery. A client who changed her mind about a trim 2 days before a ball. It is Mrs. Ball. Pryke, who decided 3 years ago that Edith had earned the room above the workroom, a decision she made quietly, without ceremony, simply informing Edith one Friday evening that the room was hers if she wanted it. The daily responsibility that falls to Edith is considerable, and it goes well beyond her own stitching, though her own stitching remains, without question, the finest in the house. She oversees the cutting of the most important commissions, standing beside the forewoman as the pattern pieces are laid against the fabric to be sure not an inch of expensive silk is wasted. She corrects the improver's work when it falls short, gently when she can manage it, firmly when the deadline demands it. She is, in every sense that matters inside these 4 walls, the standard against which the rest of the room measures its own progress, and she has come to understand, over the last 3 years in this position, that the room's whole working temper rises or falls a little with her own. There is one small, private thing about Edith that her employer does not know and would likely disapprove of if she did. Tucked into the drawer of the small table, side her bed upstairs, is a battered, much-read novel her younger sister sent her 3 Christmases ago. A story of a governess who marries above her station and finds happiness she never expected to be allowed. Edith has read it perhaps 30 times. She does not entirely believe such things happen. Not really, not to women like her. But she keeps the book anyway, and on nights when her hands ache too badly to hold a needle a moment longer, she reads 2 or 3 pages by candlelight before sleep takes her, and allows herself, just for those few minutes, to imagine a different arithmetic than the one she actually lives inside. The house itself keeps its own small rhythms and superstitions, the sort that accumulate in any workplace where the same people spend the greater part of their waking lives together, year after year. No new gown is ever cut on a Friday, if it can possibly wait until Monday, a superstition none of the women could trace to any real origin, but which every one of them nonetheless observed without question, a small inherited caution passed down from forewoman to forewoman long before Mrs. Potts Pryke ever took up the post. A stray pin found already stuck, point upward, in a chair or a hem was considered, by long tradition, a sign of ill luck for whoever sat upon it unknowing, and the youngest apprentices were taught within their first week always to lay a pin down, flat head toward the room's window, rather than its door. A small rule, so thoroughly absorbed by every hand in the workroom that none of them could have explained where it first came from, even if asked directly. Edith herself does not put much real stock in any of it, or tells herself she does not, and yet she has never once in 15 years tested the matter by cutting a length of good silk on a Friday afternoon. She has, too, a quieter ambition. She has never spoken aloud to anyone in this house, one that lives mostly in the private pages of the same notebook where she records her clients' measurements. Someday, when she has saved enough, she would like a small shop of her own, nothing so grand as Madame Blanchard's, just a modest establishment in a respectable suburb like Clapham or Streatham, serving the wives of clerks and shopkeepers. It is a modest dream by the standards of the women whose gowns she builds, and an almost impossibly large one by the standards of the trade she actually belongs to, and she has told no one but her sister, in a letter written and rewritten twice before she judged it fit to send. That sister, her younger by 4 years, had left England altogether 3 winters ago, emigrating to Canada with a husband who had taken up work on the railways outside Toronto, and the 2 women now knew each other almost entirely through the post, a letter perhaps every 6 weeks in each direction. Crossing an ocean that Edith herself had never seen, and likely never would. Her sister's letters were full of a rough, unfamiliar abundance. Cheap land, a house with more rooms than their childhood home in Bermondsey had ever held, snow deep enough in winter to close roads for days at a stretch. Edith kept every one of them in the same drawer as her novel, tied with a length of the same waxed thread she used in the workroom, and she read them slowly several times each before she allowed herself to write back, always careful to make her own unchanging days in Mayfair sound a little brighter and a little fuller than they perhaps were. Since she had no wish for her sister, so far from home already, to worry over her. Her mother, still living in the same rooms in Bermondsey, was by 1905 a woman well past 60, her eyesight failing in a manner uncomfortably close to what had ended the previous first-hand career at Madame Blanchard's, though she had never done needlework of any refinement herself, only the plain, hard laundry work that had kept the family fed through Edith's father's long final illness. Edith sent home a portion of her wages every month without fail, a habit so automatic by now that she rarely thought of it as a sacrifice at all, simply as one more fixed obligation in a life already built almost entirely around obligations owed to other people. Today has been what the workroom would call a heavy day, which is to say a day thick with obligation from the moment the shop opened. There is a court presentation gown for a Miss Alicia Ferrers due for its final fitting tomorrow morning. a garden party dress for a Mrs. Bramwell-Hoyt, requiring last adjustments this evening before delivery at the weekend, and the beginnings of cutting work on an entirely new commission, a wedding gown for a September ceremony that Mrs. Ashby Reeves has already declared, with the hush she reserves for her most important clients, will be the finest thing the house produces all year. Edith keeps, as every senior hand in a house like this kept, a small notebook of her own, separate from the shop's official order books, filled with measurements and notes in a private shorthand only she fully understands. F. Left shoulder, ½ inch lower than right. Allow for it in the seam. Mrs. Hoyt prefers the bodice looser than her measurements suggest. Ask before cutting. It is this notebook, more than anything, that makes her irreplaceable, because it holds 15 years of accumulated knowledge about the specific bodies and specific preferences of the women whose gowns pass through her hands, knowledge that lives nowhere else, and that no employer could simply hire a replacement to reproduce. She keeps tucked into the same notebook a short list of fabric suppliers she trusts and a shorter list still of those she does not. Warehouses near Cheapside and Spitalfields, where a bolt of silk might arrive with a flaw hidden cleverly in its middle folds, discoverable only once the cutting had already begun. This kind of practical, hard-won knowledge, which merchant to trust and which to watch closely, which client preferred silence during a fitting, and which preferred conversation, which improver could be trusted with a delicate task, filled page after page of her private book in a shorthand that would have meant nothing at all to anyone outside this trade, and everything to the women who depended on it daily. Tomorrow's page is already partly written. Miss Ferrers, at 9. Cutting continued on the Hoyt wedding commission by midday, a delivery to arrange for the garden party dress before 3. The day ahead exists already, in outline, before today has even finished, which is, if you think about it, the condition of nearly everyone whose labor serves other people's calendars rather than their own. But that is tomorrow's story. Tonight, there is still an evening's work in front of us, and the light in the tall windows is beginning, at last, to turn from gold toward grey. It's a little past 6 in the morning, and the house on this quiet Mayfair street is one of the few already awake. Edith rises in the narrow half-dark of her room above the workroom, the ceiling sloped where it meets the roofline, a single high window showing a strip of sky the color of a dove's wing. She does not light a candle yet. 15 years of rising at this hour have taught her exactly where the washstand sits, exactly how many steps to the small chest of drawers. She moves through the darkness with the confidence of a body that knows its own room by feel. The water in the jug beside her washstand is cold because the house's fires have not yet been lit, and she washes quickly, briskly, a cloth over her face and neck and arms, the shock of it doing more to wake her than any amount of standing about. She dresses in the plain, dark, practical clothing of her trade, a skirt of good serge that will not show thread or chalk marks, a high-necked blouse, a small apron with 2 deep pockets. She will fill within the hour with pins, a folding measure, a stub of tailor's chalk worn down to a sliver from years of use. Her hair she pins up quickly and without vanity, though not without care, coiled close against her head where it will stay out of her way and out of the fine silks she will be handling before the sun is fully up. She is down the back stairs by 6:30 into the workroom itself, where her first task of every single morning is the same regardless of what the day holds afterward. She lays and lights the small stove in the corner of the room, not for warmth exactly, though the room is cool at this hour, but for the flat irons that will need to be heating well before the first seam is pressed. The stove catches slowly. Coaxed with kindling, she has learned to split thin enough to take a spark quickly. and as it begins to draw properly, she sets 3 heavy flat irons on its surface to warm through their handles cold under her fingers. Their undersides already faintly rust-colored from yesterday's use despite the beeswax cloth she rubbed over them before covering the stove last evening. The workroom, in this grey early light, looks nothing like the golden busy place it will become in an hour's time. The long cutting tables stand bare and sweat, the previous day's scraps of silk and lace already cleared away. Bolts of fabric lean upright against the wall in a corner, reserved for stock, damask and satin, and a heavy ivory silk that arrived only yesterday from a warehouse near Cheapside, still wrapped in the brown paper of its delivery. Dress forms stand about the room like a small, silent crowd, still wearing their overnight dust sheets, waiting to be uncovered and dressed again in the day's unfinished work. By 7, the other women begin arriving, first in 1s and 2s, then in a steadier stream, shaking the last of the street's cold from their shoulders as they climb the stairs. Louisa arrives at 7:10, cheeks pink from the walk, and immediately crosses to the stove to check the irons, a habit so ingrained between the 2 senior hands that neither needs to ask the other whether it has been done. The improvers arrive close behind her, quieter, still finding their place in the room's unspoken order, and the 2 youngest apprentices come last, always last, breathless from hurrying the final blocks after leaving their lodgings later than they ought to have. By 7:30, the gas jets are lit despite the growing daylight, because fine needlework at this level of skill cannot risk shadow or poor light on a critical seam, and the room begins to fill with a sound that will define the next 12 hours. It is not one sound, but many layered together. The soft, steady hiss of a flat iron pressed against a dampened cloth over a seam. The rhythmic snip of shears through heavy fabric, a sound with its own tempo, unhurried, precise, nothing like the quick chopping motion of shears through paper. The lower, quieter click of needles pulled through cloth by hand, dozens of them at once, an almost musical undertone beneath everything else. And beneath all of it, the low murmur of voices kept deliberately soft, because a workroom of this caliber runs on concentration, and concentration does not tolerate noise. There is, even on the busiest morning, a brief pause built into the room's rhythm around 8:30, when one of the improvers carries round a tray of tea in plain white cups, poured, strong, and taken standing, no more than 5 minutes allowed before the work resumes in earnest. It is a small thing, 5 minutes out of a 14-hour day, and yet the whole room seems to lean toward it as the clock approaches the half-hour, a collective loosening of shoulders that Edith has watched repeat itself, identical in shape if never quite in mood, for 15 years running. She takes hers black, no sugar, a habit formed in her apprenticeship, years when sugar was a luxury the household could not spare, and never broken since even now that she could easily afford it. Edith's first task of the working day proper is Miss Ferrer's court presentation gown, due for its final fitting at 9. She lays it across the cutting table and examines every seam by the growing daylight through the tall windows, checking for the smallest pulling at the waist, the faintest hint that the boning beneath the bodice might show through the ivory silk when Miss Ferrer stands beneath the electric lights of the throne room at Buckingham Palace in a fortnight's time. This is one of those details that changes the picture entirely if you have never considered it before. A gown built for a court presentation is not built to be merely beautiful. It is built to survive hours of standing, a long train to be managed with a single practiced flick of the wrist, deep curtsies performed under scrutiny more intense than almost any other social occasion of the era demanded. The engineering hidden inside that silk, the whalebone and the tape and the internal stitching that holds everything in its proper shape, represents easily as much skilled labor as the visible outer beauty everyone will actually see and admire. The boning itself, thin strips of genuine whalebone cut to length and bound at each end in soft leather, so no sharp edge could ever work its way through the lining to scratch the wearer, must be channeled into place through narrow casings stitched with a precision that leaves no room at all for error. Since a channel sewn even slightly too tight would cause the bone to bow outward exactly the wrong place, spoiling the smooth line the entire bodice was built to achieve. Edith checks each channel by running her fingertips slowly along its length before the bone is ever inserted, feeling for the smallest inconsistency in the stitching that her eye alone might miss in the morning light. Whalebone itself, drawn from the baleen of whales hunted in cold northern waters, most of these women had never seen and likely never would, was growing scarcer and dearer by the year as the whaling trade that supplied it slowly declined. And more than one house in London had already begun quietly experimenting with steel strips or a stiffened cord as a substitute, though nothing yet available matched genuine baleen for the exact combination of strength and flexibility a well-fitted bodice demanded. At 9, Miss Ferrers arrives with her mother, and the fitting takes the better part of 40 minutes, Edith on her knees at points, pins held between her lips, adjusting a hem by a fraction of an inch, checking the train's fall as the young woman walks the length of the room. Now, here is where most people get this wrong when they picture a scene like this. They imagine the fitting itself as the elegant part, the client turning gracefully before a mirror while the seamstress fusses admiringly at her feet. What actually happens is closer to careful engineering under pressure. Edith's trained eye running down every seam for the smallest sign of strain, her mind already calculating 3 or 4 small corrections that must happen before tomorrow's collection, all while maintaining a manner of complete, unhurried calm for the benefit of the 2 women watching her. The performance of ease, in other words, is itself a skill, layered on top of the sewing itself. When the Ferrers ladies have gone, there is barely time to note the corrections in her private book before the next task presses forward. It is 10:15 now, and the morning has already been full in a way that would surprise anyone who imagines this work as leisurely. Louisa crosses the room with a question about the Hoyt Garden party dress, a small tear along one seam discovered during a final check that must be repaired invisibly before its delivery this evening. And Edith takes the delicate work herself, rather than risk the newer hand's less practiced stitches showing against the fine silk. Not every task this morning belongs to silk and ceremony. Around 10:30, a length of plain grey wool arrives for a housekeeper's winter uniform, a commission the house takes on quietly and without much fanfare, since even the grandest dressmaking establishments generally kept a small, steady trade in servants' clothing alongside their more celebrated work. A useful cushion of dependable income against the feast and famine rhythm the season itself imposed. Edith hands this piece to one of the improvers rather than working it herself, not from any disdain for plainer work, since she has cut 100 such uniforms in her own years of training, but because the task offers exactly the kind of steady, forgiving practice. Work important enough to matter and simple enough that a small mistake could be corrected without disaster. She watches the improver's first cut with half an eye, while continuing her own work on the wedding commission, ready to intervene only if the girl's confidence, rather than her skill, seems to be faltering. There is a rhythm to a morning like this that outsiders rarely appreciate, a rhythm built entirely around light and heat and the demands of natural fiber. Silk, Edith has explained to more than one wide-eyed apprentice over the years, has its own temperament. It shows every hesitation in a seam, every place where the hand slowed or the tension of the thread changed even slightly. It must be pressed with a barely damp cloth and an iron just hot enough and no hotter, because silk scorches, at a temperature wool, would shrug off without complaint. Velvet is its own separate discipline entirely. Never pressed flat with a hot iron on its right side at all, for fear of crushing the pile forever, but steamed instead over a kettle's spout or a damp cloth held just above the fabric surface, coaxed back into shape with a soft brush rather than heat and pressure. The women in this room have learned, through years of small failures, corrected and remembered, exactly how their materials behave. That accumulated knowledge, passed from senior hand to improver to apprentice, with no textbook and no formal instruction beyond direct example, is itself a kind of unwritten inheritance. Quietly remarkable in what it represents and almost entirely invisible to anyone outside these walls. By 11, the cutting of the new commission has begun in earnest. The wedding gown that Mrs. Ashby Reeves has staked the house's reputation on for the coming September. The heavy ivory silk, delivered only yesterday, is unrolled the full length of the largest cutting table, and Edith stands over it with the paper pattern pieces, checking and rechecking their placement before a single cut is made, because a mistake here cannot be undone. There is no unpicking a wrongly cut length of silk that cost more per yard than a working family might spend on food in a fortnight. The shears, when they finally move in one long, continuous, unhurried pull, the sound of it low and satisfying, the kind of sound that a person could, under other circumstances, find almost soothing to listen to. Beside her, one of the youngest apprentices has been given her first truly trusted task of the apprenticeship, rubbing a length of linen thread firmly against a small block of beeswax before it is handed to the hands doing the finest hand stitching on the bodice. The wax coats the thread evenly, smoothing its surface so it will not tangle or fray as it is pulled again and again through silk, and the girl performs the small task with a seriousness that makes Edith, watching from across the table, remember for a moment her own first small trusted tasks at exactly that age. The particular pride of being handed something that mattered even slightly to the finished work. A little before 11, the errand girl returns from the haberdasher 2 streets over, breathless, a small paper packet of matching thread held against her chest as though it were something considerably more precious than a few reels of silk twist. She is younger even than the apprentices, 12 at most, employed for a few shillings a week to run exactly these small errands and to fetch tea and coal as the workroom requires, and she delivers her packet to Louisa with the solemn seriousness of a girl who understands, even at her age, that a missing thread at the wrong moment can hold up an entire morning's careful work. Louisa thanks her properly, by name, a small kindness that costs nothing, and that Edith has always quietly admired in her, since not every senior hand in every house troubles to notice an errand girl at all. Shortly afterward, a difference of opinion surfaces between 2 of the improvers over a sleeve that will not sit quite right against its shoulder seam, one insisting the fault lies in the cut, the other certain it is a fault of the basting. Edith is called over to settle it, and settles it not with a lecture, but by taking the offending sleeve in her own hands, turning it this way and that against the light, and showing both young women, in a few quiet minutes, exactly where the grain of the fabric had been allowed to twist during cutting. It is a small correction, the kind that happens a dozen times in any given morning in a room like this one, and it is exactly this steady accumulation of small corrections, offered patiently rather than impatiently, that has built Edith's reputation among the newer hands as a woman worth learning from rather than merely a woman to be obeyed. The morning's work continues in this fashion, correction and precision and quiet concentration, until 12:30 arrives, and with it the day's first real pause, brief as it is. There is a correction worth making plainly here before we move further into the day. The common image of domestic sewing in this era, the pretty parlor scene of a lady with an embroidery hoop, has almost nothing in common with what has just occupied this room for 5 uninterrupted hours. This is not a pastime. It is a trade, learned over years, practiced with an intensity that would exhaust anyone unaccustomed to it. And it deserves to be understood as exactly that. Let us step back for a moment from Edith's morning and talk about what all of this actually cost, because the numbers behind a workroom like this one are woven through every single thing we have watched so far, and they deserve their own unhurried explanation. Begin with the silk itself, since silk sits at the center of nearly everything a house like Madame Blanchard's produces. A good quality silk suitable for evening wear, the kind unrolled across the cutting table this morning for the September wedding commission, cost somewhere in the range of 6 to 12 shillings a yard in 1905, depending on weight and weave, with the very finest French silks running considerably higher still. A single evening gown of the sort produced in this workroom might require 12 to 18 yards of fabric, once linings, trimmings, and the layers hidden beneath the visible outer silk are accounted for. Do the arithmetic, and the fabric alone for a single gown could run to 7 or 8 pounds before a single stitch had been sewn into it. Add to that the cost of the boning, the tape, the hooks and eyes, the lace or embroidered trim that finished the bodice, and the labor of the women who cut, stitched, fitted, and pressed it across what might be a full week of combined working hours among several hands. Men. A finished evening gown from a house of this standing, delivered in its box lined with tissue paper, might cost the client anywhere from 20 to 50 pounds, with a wedding gown of the caliber Mrs. Ashby Reeves was staking her reputation on running considerably higher again. A velvet evening cloak, lined in silk and trimmed with fur, might add another 15 or 20 pounds on top of the gown itself, and a client of real standing was rarely satisfied with a single gown at all, ordering instead an entire wardrobe for the season. A morning dress, an afternoon dress, a garden party dress, several evening gowns, each one distinct from the last, since to be seen twice in the same gown among the same circles was considered, by the standards of the day, a small social failure. Now set that figure against what the women actually earned to produce it. A senior first-hand like Edith, at the very top of her profession, after 15 years of training and practice, might earn something in the neighborhood of 25 to 30 shillings a week during the busiest weeks of the season. A figure that sounds respectable set against a laborer's wage until you remember that this same pace of pay generally did not hold through the quieter months of late summer and autumn, when many houses reduced their staff's hours, or let junior hands go entirely until the following spring brought the season back around. An improver, several years from Edith's level of skill and trust, might earn 8 or 10 shillings a week. The 2 youngest apprentices in the room, still building the raw foundation of their craft, often earned little or nothing at all in their first year, their labor understood by the trade as payment in kind, for the training itself, room and simple board provided in place of wages. Set the wages against the ordinary costs of living, and the picture sharpens further still. A single room in a respectable lodging house for a working woman ran somewhere between 4 and 7 shillings a week, depending on the neighborhood. A loaf of bread cost around 4p. A pound of tea, a luxury indulged in carefully rather than casually, might run 2 shillings or more. Meat was a weekly treat for most working women rather than a daily expectation, and a new pair of boots, sturdy enough to survive the walk to work in all weather, could easily consume a full week's wages when the old pair finally gave out. Set against these figures, Edith's wage allowed her a modest but comfortable life, especially once her free room above the workroom is factored in, a privilege that placed her considerably above many of her fellow tradeswomen elsewhere in the city. And that comparison matters, because Madame Blanchard sat toward the very fortunate end of a trade that could, in lesser houses, shade into something considerably darker. The phrase of the day for the worst of it was sweated labor. and it described conditions in the East End and in the cheaper dressmaking establishments across the city where women worked 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours in a single day for wages that barely covered rent and bread, often in cramped rooms with poor ventilation, producing garments for the very ready-made clothing trade that was, even in 1905, beginning to compete with bespoke houses like this one. Reformers and social investigators had been documenting these conditions for years by this point, and the public conscience, slowly and unevenly, was beginning to stir. Parliamentary committee would hold hearings on the sweated trades within the year, and public exhibitions exposing the worst of these conditions were being organized in the very city where Edith worked her comparatively fortunate hours in a comparatively well-lit room. The social researcher Charles Booth had spent the better part of 2 decades mapping poverty across London street by street, and his surveys published across the 1890s and still widely discussed among reform-minded circles in 1905. Color-coded picture of exactly which streets house comfortable working families and which housed the chronic, grinding poverty that swallowed entire neighborhoods whole. Needlewomen appeared again and again in his findings, clustered disproportionately in the poorer bands of his map. Their trade singled out repeatedly as one where a woman's skill and a woman's poverty could sit uncomfortably close together. The fault lying not with any lack of talent in her hands, but with a market that had simply never been built to reward that talent fairly. Edith herself had never read Booth's work directly, since such volumes were not the sort of thing that found their way easily into a workroom, but she had heard it discussed, second-hand and imperfectly, by a client's maid who fancied herself informed on such matters. And something in the description had struck her as uncomfortably close to home, even in its imprecise retelling. Set against this backdrop, the tailoring trade for men, a closely related but distinctly organized branch of the needle trade, offers a useful point of comparison. A skilled male tailor working in a good West End house could often command wages considerably higher than even a first-hand like Edith, sometimes £2 or even £3 a week at the top of his profession, a gap explained less by any real difference in the delicacy of the work, since a well-cut coat demands every bit as much precision, and more by the simple, stubborn fact that men's trades had organized themselves into unions decades before women's trades had managed anything comparable, and had used that organization to bargain for wages the market would otherwise never have offered. It was a comparison the women of Edith's workroom rarely discussed openly, since there was little comfort to be found in it and no easy remedy close at hand, but it sat there nonetheless. A plain fact of the trade's arithmetic that no amount of skill on Edith's part could entirely overcome. There is a further wrinkle in this economic picture that surprises most people the first time they hear it. The wealthiest clients, the very women whose custom kept a house like Madame Blanchard's afloat, were very often the slowest to actually pay for what they ordered. Aristocratic families frequently ran accounts with their dressmaker for months or even years at a stretch, settling bills only when it suited them, a practice that placed enormous strain on the houses that served them, despite those houses catering to the wealthiest clientele in the city. Mrs. Ashby Reeves kept a careful private ledger of exactly which families were reliable and which were not, and more than one respected dressmaking house of this era failed entirely, not for want of skilled hands or fine silk, but because its most fashionable clients simply never got around to settling what they owed. Edith knew nothing of these particulars directly, since the ledgers belonged to Mrs. Ashby Reeves and Mrs. Pryke alone. But she understood well enough, from overheard fragments of conversation between the two women, that the house's fortunes rested on a foundation considerably less solid than its elegant showroom suggested. Consider, too, the total cost of simply presenting a single daughter to society across one full season. since a gown here and there tells only part of the story. A family of good standing bringing out a debutante might spend £200 or more across a single season on clothing alone: court gown, ball gowns, morning dresses, walking costumes, tea gowns, evening cloaks, gloves, shoes, hats to match each ensemble. The sum easily rivaling what a skilled tradesman earned across several entire years of steady work. Add to this the cost of the presentation itself, the flowers, the carriage hire, the entertaining that accompanied it, and a single season for a single daughter could consume a sum that would have supported Edith's entire workroom, wages and all, for the better part of a year. This was, in its own way, simply the price of the performance the whole street outside had been built to stage, a performance in which Edith's own labor formed one small, essential, and almost entirely uncredited part. It is worth comparing Edith's position, briefly, to that of a lady's maid employed directly within one of these grand households, since the two roles are often confused by anyone looking back at this era from a distance. A lady's maid earned somewhat less in direct wages than Edith did, often £12 to £20 a year all told, but received her full room and board within the household itself, her meals, her small quarters, sometimes her mistress's cast-off clothing passed down as an unofficial addition to her pay. Edith's own arrangement sat somewhere between the maid's dependent security and a fully independent tradeswoman's exposure to the market, drawing a proper wage while relying on her employer's goodwill for her room rather than any legal entitlement to it. Neither position offered anything resembling true financial independence by the standards later generations of working women would come to expect, but the dressmaker's trade offered Edith something the maid's position generally could not: a skill that belonged entirely to her, portable from house to house, negotiable on her own terms should she ever choose to leave Madame Blanchard's for a rival establishment willing to pay more for a first hand of her reputation. For Edith, none of this was abstract. She had an older cousin who worked in exactly such conditions in a cheaper establishment near Whitechapel, a woman whose hands, by 35, were already showing the strain that Edith's, protected by a better trade and a kinder house, had so far largely escaped. The two women wrote to each other perhaps once a month, and Edith's cousin's letters carried, beneath their careful cheerfulness, a weariness that Edith recognized and quietly, privately, felt grateful not to share. There, but for the fortune of a single lucky introduction 15 years ago, Edith sometimes thought, might her own hands look exactly the same? There is more to understand here, and we will come back to the broader shape of this trade again before the night is through. For now, let us return to Edith and the middle hours of her day, because the workroom does not pause for economics, no matter how much the economics shape everything happening inside it. It is 1 o'clock, and the workroom has fallen into its brief midday quiet. There is no formal dining room for the staff here, no long table with a proper meal laid out, only a corner near the window where the women take turns eating whatever they have brought from home or purchased from a nearby shop on their way in that morning. Edith's meal today is simple: bread and a wedge of cheese wrapped in a cloth, and a cup of tea brewed on the small stove that has spent the whole morning heating flat irons and will spend the next few minutes gratefully heating water instead. She eats standing or perched on the edge of a stool near the window, because a full 12 hours of sitting bent over needlework takes its own toll on a body, and the brief change of posture matters more than it might sound. Louisa joins her at the window, and for these 20 minutes the two senior hands allow themselves the kind of easy, unguarded conversation the rest of the day does not permit: gossip about a client's difficult temper, a shared laugh over one of the younger apprentice's earnest mistakes, a quiet complaint about the ache that has settled into both their right hands for so many years of the same repeated motion. Somewhere below, in a private sitting room adjoining the showroom, Mrs. Ashby Reeves takes her own midday meal from a tray sent up by a nearby restaurant, cutlets, or a cold chicken and a proper pot of tea, served on china rather than the plain white cups the workroom uses. Edith has glimpsed the tray once or twice, carried up the front stairs by the errand girl, and feels no real resentment about the difference, only a plain, clear-eyed awareness of it, the kind of awareness that comes from having lived inside a hierarchy so long it no longer requires anger to notice, only attention. This is a small pleasure worth noticing, because the whole of Edith's day is otherwise structured almost entirely around other people's needs. Her mornings serve the client's fitting schedule. Her afternoons will serve the forewoman's deadlines and Mrs. Ashby Reeves' exacting standards. But this 20 minutes at the window, cheese and bread, and unguarded talk with a friend who understands exactly what her hands feel like at the end of a long morning belongs entirely to her, and she guards it fiercely, though she would never think to apply the word fierce to something so quiet. By 1:30, the room is at work again, and the afternoon brings its own character. Where the morning was dominated by fittings and cutting, precise and exacting, the afternoon settles into the longer, steadier rhythm of construction, seam after seam, hour after hour, the kind of sustained hand and eye work that built the genuine artistry of the trade. Edith spends much of it on the September wedding commission, working now on the delicate hand-finished interior seams that no one but the bride herself and perhaps her lady's maid will ever see, seams that must nonetheless be as perfect as anything on the visible exterior because Edith's own private standard. Two entirely separate from what any client might notice or reward, would not permit anything less. Just after 2, a second client arrives, unannounced, a Mrs. Templeton Hale, wife of a wealthy shipping merchant rather than an aristocrat by birth, one of the newer sort of clients the house has begun cultivating as old money and new money increasingly mingled at the same balls and garden parties. She has come to discuss an entirely new commission of her own, a gown for a reception at a foreign embassy the following month, and her manner with Edith carries a faint edge that the daughters of older families rarely bother with, a need to demonstrate, through slightly excessive fussiness about fabric and trim, that her money is every bit as good as anyone else's in the room. Edith has learned, over years of exactly this kind of encounter, to answer such anxiety with unhurried patience rather than impatience, understanding, without ever saying so, that Mrs. Templeton Hale's sharpness has very little to do with silk and a great deal to do with her own uncertain place among the circles she has only recently married into. At 2:30, a difficulty arises that occupies the better part of an hour. Mrs. Bramwell Hoyt's garden party dress, the one due for delivery this very evening, is found upon a final inspection to have a seam along the left side that pulls slightly when the wearer raises her arm, a flaw invisible when the garment hangs still, but immediately apparent in motion. Exactly the sort of motion a garden party's endless rounds of handshaking and teacup lifting would demand. It must be unpicked and resewn before the day is out, and this is the kind of moment that separates a merely competent hand from a genuinely skilled one. Edith takes the work herself, settling into the focused stillness that difficult repair demands, her fingers finding the tiny stitches by feel as much as by sight, unpicking each one with a small, sharp tool no longer than her smallest finger, careful never to snag or stress the silk around it. There is a meditative state that settles over a skilled hand doing this sort of careful, repetitive, exacting work, and it is worth pausing on because it runs entirely counter to how most people imagine factory-era labor of any kind. Edith's attention narrows to the seam in front of her, the room's other sounds fading to a background hum her breathing slowing, without her quite noticing it has happened. It is not unlike, she has said once or twice to a curious apprentice, the way a person might lose themselves in a piece of music, except the music here is made of tension and give, of silk moving just so beneath careful fingers, of a problem solved one tiny stitch at a time. Somewhere in the middle of this work, without quite noticing she has begun, Edith falls into a habit the whole workroom has long since grown fond enough of to simply leave alone, humming very softly under her breath. Old ballads her mother used to sing over the washtub in Bermondsey, half-remembered tunes with words she can no longer entirely recall. It is not a performance and never has been. It is simply what her voice does, unbidden, when her hands are occupied with something demanding enough to require her full attention and simple enough to leave some small corner of her mind free to wander. The two youngest apprentices, on their first weeks in the room, had found it faintly strange. By now, months into their training, they would likely notice its absence far more than they notice its presence, the way a person notices a clock has stopped only once the ticking they had stopped hearing consciously is gone. By 3:30, the seam is resewn, invisible now even to Edith's own critical eye, and the dress is pressed one final time and hung ready for its evening delivery. There is a correction beat worth placing here, plainly, because it runs against nearly everything the popular imagination assumes about this kind of labor. This was not drudgery performed without thought or care. This was expertise, applied with the same seriousness a surgeon might bring to a delicate procedure, on work that would be worn once, admired for an evening, and very likely never thought of again by the woman who wore it. The gap between the skill poured into that seam and the credit it would ever receive is, we will come to see later tonight, one of the defining features of this entire trade. The afternoon continues in this fashion, hour folding into hour, the light through the tall windows shifting slowly from the high white of early afternoon towards something warmer and more golden. 4 o'clock arrives, then 5 behind it. There is a moment near 4 when Mrs. Marmont, Ashby Reeves herself, comes up from the showroom below to inspect the progress on the September commission. The whole room's posture changes subtly at her arrival, backs straightening, needles moving with slightly more visible purpose. Though nothing is said, nothing needs to be. She examines the cut pieces laid across the table with a critical eye trained by her own decades in the trade, asks Edith 2 or 3 pointed questions about the boning arrangement in the bodice, and departs again with a single nod that Edith has learned, over years of working beneath her, to recognize as genuine approval, since Ashby Reeves is not a woman inclined toward loose praise. This small exchange says something worth noting about the social architecture of the room, because it is not a simple hierarchy of owner and worker with nothing else between them. Edith answers to Mrs. Ashby Reeves, certainly, and to the forewoman who manages the day-to-day running of the workroom schedule. But she also holds her own considerable authority over Louisa and the hands beneath her, and Louisa in turn holds authority over the improvers, and the improvers over the 2 young apprentices who are, at this point in the afternoon, mostly occupied with the least glamorous tasks the room requires, tidying scraps, threading needles for the senior hands, running errands to the haberdasher 2 streets over for a matching thread the morning's supply has run short of. Everyone in this room knows exactly where they stand relative to everyone else, and that knowledge, absorbed rather than formally taught, shapes every interaction that happens within these walls. Let us step back for a moment from the afternoon's specific tasks and talk about something that runs beneath everything we have watched today, because it touches this workroom as surely as the silk itself does. The health of a woman's hands and eyes was, in a trade like this one, both her greatest asset and her greatest vulnerability. and the workroom hierarchy Edith has spent 15 years climbing was built, in part, around managing exactly that vulnerability. Sustained, close needlework by gaslight, hour after hour, day after day, took a genuine physical toll that the trade understood well, even if it rarely spoke of it directly. Eye strain was near universal among senior hands by their 30s, and more than a few women in Edith's position wore small spectacles they were privately embarrassed by, purchased from a local optician rather than a proper physician, since a proper physician's fee sat well beyond what most seamstresses could spare. Cramped, repetitive hand postures produced their own quiet suffering, the same aching Edith and Louisa had traded complaints about over their midday bread and cheese. A condition the trade simply understood as the cost of doing this kind of work and rarely thought to name more formally. There was a darker concern too, one that touched every crowded workroom in the city, regardless of how well or poorly it was run. Long hours in enclosed rooms, close air, the general strain of insufficient rest made needlewomen and similar tradeswomen more vulnerable than the general population to consumption, the tuberculosis that filled so many hospital wards and cemeteries across London in this era. It was not spoken of directly in a room like this one, not on an ordinary working day, but it sat quietly in the background of how the trade understood itself. Part of why a house with good ventilation and reasonable hours like Madame Blanchard's was valued genuinely by the women who worked there rather than merely tolerated. The legal landscape around all of this had begun, slowly and unevenly, to shift. The Factory and Workshop Acts, amended and expanded across the final decades of the previous century, and again in the first years of this one, had begun placing real limits on the hours young workers and women could be required to labor, along with basic requirements around ventilation, sanitation, and safety in workshops of a certain size. Enforcement remained patchy, especially in the smaller, poorer establishments, where sweated labor persisted largely unchecked. But a house of Mrs. Denyer, Ashby Reeves's standing generally observed these standards not merely from legal obligation, but because a reputation for treating her staff decently was, in its own quiet way, good for business. Skilled hands like Edith did not grow on trees, and a forewoman who drove her women into illness or exhaustion soon found herself training replacements instead of producing gowns. Education, too, shaped the workroom's internal life in ways worth understanding. Most of the women here had left formal schooling at 12 or 13, the legal minimum, with a basic grounding in reading, writing, and arithmetic that served them well enough for measurements and correspondence, but rarely extended much further. The real education of the trade happened entirely inside rooms like this one, an apprenticeship system that functioned in effect as its own complete school, one where the curriculum was cutting and fitting and pressing, and where advancement depended entirely on demonstrated skill rather than any certificate or examination. Edith herself read reasonably well, better than most in the room, a habit her mother had encouraged even amid the family's difficult years, and she had passed a little of that encouragement onto the two young apprentices currently in her charge, lending them, on rare, quiet evenings, a penny paper or a cheap edition of a popular story to read by their own candles. There was, beyond the workroom's own informal instruction, no safety net waiting for a woman like Edith should illness or old age eventually end her working life. No pension from her employer, no state provision of the kind that would only begin appearing in England a few years later. What protection existed came instead through voluntary friendly societies, mutual aid clubs, into which working women paid a small weekly subscription in exchange for a modest payment during sickness and a contribution toward a decent burial when the time finally came. Edith belonged to one such society, a shilling set aside from her wages each week without fail, a habit she had adopted early in her apprenticeship on the advice of an older hand who had seen too many needlewomen reach their later years with nothing at all. It was not a large sum, and it would not have supported her indefinitely, but it represented, in a life otherwise governed almost entirely by other people's decisions, one small deliberate act of providing for her own future self. Beyond health and education, there was the broader question of what a woman in Edith's position was expected to know, and how she was expected to carry herself in a society that placed enormous weight on the outward performance of respectability. An unmarried woman of nearly 30, living independently above her place of work, occupied a position that would have raised eyebrows in some circles and drawn quiet admiration in others. She was expected to be modest in dress and manner, careful in her associations, unfailingly polite, regardless of how a difficult client might behave toward her. And this is the part of the story that rarely gets told plainly. The social code governing a woman like Edith was every bit as exacting and demanding as the technical standards governing her needlework, and she had learned to meet both with the same quiet, practiced competence. Religion, too, shaped the rhythm of her week in ways that touched even a workroom this busy. Sunday remained almost universally across London Strait a day of rest, church attendance expected of most working women, whether from genuine faith, social expectation, or simple gratitude for the one full day the week afforded her body to recover. Edith attended a modest parish church, a few streets from the shop most Sundays, less from deep devotion, if she was honest with herself, than from the plain comfort of an hour spent sitting still with nothing at all expected of her hands. Courtship, where it happened at all among the women of the workroom, tended to happen slowly and at a careful distance from the shop itself, since Mrs. Marnier Ashby Reeves took a dim view of followers appearing at the door, and any young man calling too regularly was quietly discouraged from doing so. 2 years earlier, one of the workroom's most promising second-hands, a young woman named Florrie, who had seemed destined for Edith's own path, had married a clerk from a shipping office and left the trade within the month, and her departure had been marked in the room not with resentment, but with a kind of wistful, complicated celebration. A small gift of embroidered handkerchiefs, stitched secretly by the other women in whatever spare minutes they could steal across a fortnight. Edith had contributed the finest of the lot, a border of forget-me-nots worked in silk thread so fine it had taken her 3 full evenings, and she had felt, handing it over, both a genuine happiness for her friend and a private unspoken awareness that her own path had simply narrowed by nothing more dramatic than the ordinary passage of years towards something considerably more solitary. There is more to understand here than we have time for tonight, but hold this much of it close as we return now to the day's final hours, because everything we have just discussed, the strain on the body, the weight of social expectation, the slow, uneven progress of reform. It is nearly 5 o'clock, and the light through the tall bay windows of the workroom has begun its long, slow turn from the white gold of late afternoon into something richer and more amber, the quality of light that only comes in the last hour or two before an English spring evening. The work tables, which held such orderly, purposeful chaos only an hour ago, are beginning to clear as the day's most urgent tasks are finished one by one. Bolts of silk that were unrolled and measured this morning have been rolled again and returned to their corner. Fabric scraps, offcuts of ivory and pale blue and a deep wine-colored velvet from a commission finished earlier in the week, lie scattered across the floorboards in small drifts, waiting to be swept away before the room can properly rest. Along the far wall, a rack holds the fruits of the past several days' labor, evening gowns finished and awaiting collection, garden party dresses pressed and ready, a lace tea gown so delicate that it has been draped over its hanger with a folded cloth beneath to protect it from the wood. In this late light, with the gas jets not yet lit and the last of the sun coming warm and low through the windows, The rack of finished garments takes on a beauty that none of the women in the room, accustomed as they are to fine fabric. Velvet in this light holds color the way water holds the sky, deep and shifting. Silk catches the gold and seems for a moment to glow from somewhere inside itself rather than merely reflect the light falling on it. Lace, layered over its pale lining, throws small shadows across the work table, like frost on a window pane, a pattern within a pattern. Edith's own shears, heavy forged iron with long, slightly curved blades and handles worn smooth by 15 years of her own grip, hang now on their designated hook beside the cutting table, rather than lying loose where a careless hand might knock them to the floor. She oils them herself once a week without fail, small ritual passed down from her own forewoman, wiping each blade with a cloth barely dampened before working the oil into the pivot until the blades swing open and closed with no resistance at all, only the low, satisfying whisper of well-kept metal. A good pair of shears, properly cared for, could serve a seamstress her entire working life, and Edith has come to think of hers quietly, the way another woman might think of a piece of inherited jewelry, an object that has been present for every significant piece of work she has ever produced. The room smells, at this hour, of the accumulated labor of the whole day. Layered together, pressed silk carries its own faint, warm, slightly mineral scent, sharpened wherever the flat irons have passed most recently. Lavender water, which Edith and several of the other senior hands used to dampen their pressing cloths, since a hint of lavender was thought to leave the finished fabric smelling faintly, pleasantly fresh, rather than simply hot and flat. Drifts through the room in soft waves. Beneath both of these sits the steady warm smell of beeswax, used to strengthen and smooth the linen thread before hand-stitching, and the drier, cleaner scent of wood polish on the long oak tables, reapplied by the youngest apprentices every few days as part of their ongoing training in the room's proper upkeep. This is one of those moments where the small detail tells a much bigger story, because the ritual we are about to watch, the slow, deliberate closing down of a working day, reveals something about this trade that its exhausting hours and modest wages could easily obscure. There was in a well-run workroom like this one, a genuine and sustaining satisfaction in the order and beauty of the space itself. A pride taken not merely in the garments produced, but in the discipline of the room that produced them. Edith crosses to the last few pieces of work still requiring attention before the day can properly close. There is a final scene to finish on tomorrow's cutting layout. The wedding commission's bodice pieces basted together loosely enough to hold their shape overnight without straining the delicate silk. There is a length of heavy damask that arrived late in the day and must be checked and measured before it can be shelved. Edith, running the fabric gently through her fingers, as she does feeling for any flaw or inconsistency in the weave that the eye alone might miss. The rhythmic click and whir of the workroom's single hand-crank sewing machine, used sparingly and only for the long, straight seams that hand-stitching would take hours to complete, has fallen silent now, its last user of the day, one of the more experienced hands, having finished her final seam some 20 minutes ago. In its silence, the sound of the room shifts entirely quieter, now dominated by the soft rustle of fabric being folded, and the occasional low murmur of two women comparing notes on the day's work before they part for the evening. One by one, the improvers and apprentices finish their own final small tasks and take their leave, gathering shawls and hats, calling soft goodnights to Edith and Louisa as they head down the back stairs and out into the cooling street, most of them bound for lodging houses a 10 or 15-minute walk away. The room empties gradually rather than all at once, and by 5:30 it is down to its last few occupants, Edith, Louisa, and one of the senior hands finishing the delicate embroidery detail on a bodice that must be ready for a client's collection the following morning. Now begins the part of the evening the workroom itself thinks of without ever quite putting it into words as putting the room to rest. It is a task performed with the same quiet care as the day's needlework, because a well-kept workroom, Edith learned from her own forewoman many years ago, is itself a kind of respect paid to the trade, a way of honoring the work by honoring the space where the work happens. Louisa takes up a soft bristled broom and begins at the far end of the room, sweeping the day's accumulated threads and fabric scraps into a small, neat pile that will be collected in the morning and sorted, since even the smallest scraps of good silk have their uses, patchwork linings, sample swatches for future clients. Nothing in a house of this caliber is wasted without thought. The broom moves in slow, even strokes across the worn oak floorboards, and the sound of it, soft and rhythmic, fills the emptying room in a way that feels less like cleaning and more like a kind of closing prayer for the day just finished. Edith, meanwhile, moves among the dress forms that have stood witness to the whole day's work, lifting clean cotton dust sheets from a cupboard along the wall and settling them over each one in turn, tucking the fabric carefully so no dust can find its way into the delicate pinned work still in progress. There is something almost tender in this specific task, though she has performed it thousands of times across 15 years and would likely be embarrassed if anyone suggested as much aloud. The dress forms, silent and faceless as they are, have become, in her long years in this room, something closer to familiar presences than mere tools, each one slightly different in its proportions, each one suited to a specific kind of body she has come to recognize instantly. The pins, hundreds of them scattered across the tables and caught in the folds of half-finished garments throughout the day, are gathered next, sorted by the youngest of the remaining hands into small wooden compartmentalized trays, brass pins in one section, the finer, more delicate ones, reserved for silk work, kept carefully separate from the heavier pins used on wool and damask. Buttons, carved from bone and mother of pearl, and the occasional precious jet for morning commissions, are returned to their own labeled boxes, each one checked against the day's work. To be sure, none have gone missing into the folds of a finished garment. The dress forms take the longest of all these small closing tasks, since there are 9 of them scattered about the room in various stages of the day's work, and each cotton sheet must be settled just so, tucked beneath the wooden base, rather than simply draped over the top. So a stray draft from beneath the door cannot lift a corner and expose the pinned work overnight to dust or to the attention of a curious mouse. Edith moves from one to the next with an unhurried, almost ceremonial patience, the same patience she brings to a difficult seam, because she has long since decided, without ever quite deciding it consciously, that this final task deserves exactly the same care as the first stitch of the morning. A room closed carelessly, she believes, has a way of greeting its workers carelessly again the next day, and a room closed with proper attention seems, however irrationally, to offer a gentler start when the gas jets are lit once more at 7:30 tomorrow. By 6 o'clock, the last of the day's true work is finished, and Edith crosses to the gas sconces along the walls, dimming them one by one rather than extinguishing them entirely, since full darkness has not yet properly settled and a workroom left in complete black feels, to her, faintly unsettling in a way she has never quite managed to explain to anyone. The light softens with each sconce she adjusts, until the room is bathed in something warm and low and gentle, closer to candlelight than to the bright working gas of the afternoon, the long shadows of the dress form stretching soft and indistinct across the swept floorboards. There is a tranquility to a workroom in exactly this state that is worth sitting with for a moment, because it stands in such contrast to the room's daytime character, where the morning and afternoon demanded precision, speed, an almost military attentiveness to detail and deadline. The room now, in this last half hour before the final departures, asks for nothing at all. The work is done. The space is clean. Tomorrow's obligations exist only as notes in Edith's private book, not yet demands upon her actual hands. For these few minutes, the room simply is quiet and orderly and softly lit, and the three women who remain within it allow themselves, without quite naming it as such, a small collective exhale. Louisa gathers her shawl and bids Edith good night. Her steps unhurried on the stairs, the front door below opening and closing softly a few minutes later as she sets off toward her own lodgings, a short walk away. The last of the senior hands follows soon after, her good night quieter still, both women's faces carrying the particular pleasant weariness of a full day's skilled work honestly finished. For the first time since 6:30 that morning, Edith Marsh is alone now. In the workroom, she has spent 15 years learning to call, in every way that matters, her own. Let us stop here for a moment and talk about something larger than this single day, because the forces beginning to gather at the edges of Edith's world in the spring of 1905 would, within a generation, remake this entire trade almost beyond recognition. The hand-cranked Singer sewing machine, standing quiet now in the corner of the workroom, represented, even then, the leading edge of a change that had already begun transforming the clothing trade decades earlier and would only accelerate in the years ahead. Sewing machines had existed since the middle of the previous century, but their steady improvement and falling cost meant that by 1905 they were becoming capable, in a way they simply had not been a generation before, of the fine, controlled work that bespoke houses like Madame Blanchard's had always insisted required a skilled hand alone. Edith's own house used the machine sparingly and selectively, reserving it for long, straight seams where speed mattered more than the invisible perfection only handwork could achieve. But she had heard, from women who trained in other houses, of establishments beginning to rely on the machine, got cutting both time and cost from garments that a client, seeing only the finished result, would likely never think to question. Beyond the machine itself sat a larger and more unsettling development still. Ready-made clothing, produced in factories rather than fitted individually to a single body, had spent decades expanding from cheap workwear into territory that had once belonged entirely to the bespoke trade. The great department stores springing up across London, expanding their ready-made departments year by year, offered increasingly respectable middle-class women an alternative to the individually fitted gown, one that cost a fraction of what a house like Madame Blanchard's charged and arrived, if not perfectly fitted. 1. Then close enough, for most purposes, most of the time. It was for now threat felt mainly at the edges of the trade, in the middle market rather than at the very top, where Edith's aristocratic clients still insisted on individual attention no factory could replicate. But the direction of travel was becoming difficult to ignore for anyone paying close attention, and Edith, watching the sewing machine's steady click each day, sometimes wondered, the private hours before sleep, what her own trade might look like by the time she reached the age her forewoman was now. There were other forces moving too, further from the workroom's daily concerns, but no less real for it. Only 2 years earlier, a small group of women had founded an organization dedicated to winning women the vote, and their activities, still relatively modest in 1905, but growing louder and more visible with each passing season, were beginning to seep into the conversations of even a workroom. Louisa had mentioned, only that week, a pamphlet a friend had passed to her, and though the two senior hands had not discussed it at length, something in the exchange had carried a weight neither woman quite named aloud. Elsewhere in the trade, quiet efforts toward organizing needleworkers into unions had been building for years. seeking shorter hours and steadier wages for a workforce that had, for generations, had almost no collective voice at all in the terms of its own labor. Progress was slow, resistance from employers considerable, and the great houses of the West End remained for the most part untouched by any formal organizing. But the conversation itself had begun, and conversations, however quiet at first, have a way of eventually becoming something louder. Within a year or so of this particular evening, a new federation dedicated specifically to organizing women workers across a range of trades would be founded, drawing together laundresses and boxmakers and needlewomen under a single banner for the first time in any organized way. It marked the kind of beginning that, looked at from a comfortable distance of more than a century, is easy enough to recognize as the start of something considerably larger. Further west, along Oxford Street and Kensington High Street, the great department stores that would eventually help finish the bespoke trade's long decline were already substantial concerns in 1905, Whiteley's grandly billing itself as a universal provider capable of supplying nearly anything a household might require. Harrods, expanding its ready-made departments year after year to serve a middle class hungry for respectable fashion at a fraction of a West End house's prices. None of these stores could yet touch the very top of the trade where Edith worked, the aristocratic clients who still insisted on individual measurements and a first-hand personal attention. Her broader cultural shift was moving alongside these commercial ones, one that touched fashion itself as directly as it touched anything else. The figure the newspapers had taken to calling the new woman, educated, increasingly likely to work for wages before marriage if she worked at all, occasionally seen cycling through the parks in a shorter, simpler skirt that would have scandalized her grandmother, represented a small but growing challenge to the elaborate, restrictive fashions Edith's own trade had built its entire reputation on producing. A gown requiring an hour merely to lace into correctly sat awkwardly alongside a world, beginning, however slowly, to value practicality and freedom of movement over pure ornament. Edith had cut precisely one cycling costume in her career so far, for a younger client whose mother had disapproved audibly throughout the entire fitting, and she remembered it now as a small, telling sign of a direction the whole trade would eventually be forced to follow, whether it wished to or not. But the middle ranks of the dressmaking trade, the smaller houses serving clerks' wives and shopkeepers' daughters, the very tier Edith herself dreamed of one day serving with a shop of her own, were already feeling the pressure of these larger, cheaper rivals, in ways that would only intensify as the new century wore on. The world beyond this workroom's tall windows was shifting slowly and unevenly, and the daughters and nieces of women like Edith would grow up into a set of possibilities their aunts had never been offered. Typewriting, shop work in the new department stores, eventually clerical positions in offices that had, within Edith's own lifetime, employed almost no women at all. None of it had arrived yet in any form that touched Edith's own daily life directly. But the ground beneath this entire trade, so certain and unshakable in its rhythms today, was already quietly beginning to move. For a woman like Edith, none of this history had fully announced itself, yet as history. It simply felt, most days, like the ordinary texture of an ordinary working life, a machine in the corner, a pamphlet passed between friends, a department store's growing window displays, glimpsed on a rare afternoon off. But we, looking back from the comfortable distance of more than a century, can see what she could not yet see clearly, that the world she moved through with such quiet, practiced competence was standing, however invisibly, at the very edge of enormous change. Let us return now to the room itself, because Edith's evening is not quite finished, and there is a kind of patience worth watching a little longer before we let her rest. Before stepping back to consider what a day like this one actually reveals, it is worth sitting a moment longer inside the workroom, this final hour of soft gaslight, because there are still one or two small tasks left for Edith's hands alone, and the way she performs them tells us something the rest of the day has only hinted at. She crosses to the long cutting table one final time and runs her palm flat across its surface, checking, out of habit rather than genuine necessity, this hour, for any stray pin or forgotten scrap that might mar tomorrow's fresh work. The table is bare and smooth beneath her hand, its oak surface worn to a soft sheen by years of exactly this kind of care, and she allows herself, for just a moment, the small private satisfaction of a task completed properly from beginning to end. She checks the stove once more, banking what remains of its coals so it will hold a gentle warmth through the night without any danger of sparking once the room is left unattended. A task she performs with the same unthinking precision she brings to a difficult seam, because carelessness here, in a room full of silk and paper patterns, would carry consequences far beyond a ruined gown. She checks the gas at each remaining sconce, turning the last of them low but never fully dark, and casts one final look across the room before she turns toward the stairs, her eyes moving from the shrouded dress forms to the rack of finished gowns to the small drift of tomorrow's work waiting patiently on the cutting table. Standing here, in this last quiet moment, before she climbs to her own room above, we can step back and see something about this single day that the busy hours themselves rarely allow a person to notice while they are living inside them. The first pattern worth naming is the sheer density of obligation that fills a day like Edith's, obligation stacked upon obligation with almost no space left over for anything belonging purely to herself. Her mornings serve her clients' fittings, her afternoons serve her employer's deadlines, her evenings serve the room's own need for order before tomorrow's demands can properly begin. Even her 20 minutes of bread and cheese at the window was carved out of a schedule built around everyone's needs but her own, a small stolen pleasure other than a granted right. This density of obligation was not unique to Edith. It was in its own shape the defining condition of nearly every working woman of her era. Time itself parceled out almost entirely to the service of others, with whatever remained left over, often precious little, belonging to the self. The second pattern is the near total invisibility of the labor itself, set against the enormous visibility of what that labor ultimately produced. A client would admire her finished gown at a garden party, would perhaps receive a compliment on its color or its cut, and would very likely never think, even for a moment, of the specific woman whose hands had spent a full day correcting an invisible seam so that gown might survive a single afternoon's handshakes and teacup lifting without pulling wrong. This is one of those details that changes the picture entirely once you have noticed it. The beauty everyone saw was real, but it rested on an entire structure of skilled, careful, largely unacknowledged labor that the finished product was specifically designed to make disappear. Think of every seam Edith corrected today, the pulling shoulder on the court gown, the tearing seam on the garden party dress, the twisted grain in an improver's sleeve. Every single one of them was solved precisely so that no one ever would notice it had been a problem at all. Success in this trade looked exactly like nothing happening. The third pattern is the gap, wide and largely unbridgeable in Edith's world, between capability and permission. She possessed, by any honest measure, a remarkable depth of skill, judgment refined across 15 years, an eye that could correct a client's asymmetry before the client herself had ever noticed it. And yet the economic and social structures around her granted her almost none of the autonomy that skill might, in a different arrangement of the world, have earned her. It could not easily open her own house, lacking both the capital and the social standing such a venture would require. She could not fully control her own hours, her own wages, the terms under which her labor was purchased. Her capability was, in the truest sense, extraordinary. Her permission to act on it independently was not. The fourth pattern touches something more intimate still. The economics of appearance that ran through every single transaction in this workroom, without ever being spoken of directly. A client paid in the end, not merely for silk and thread and skilled labor, but for the performance of effortlessness itself, the illusion that beauty of this caliber simply happened, unburdened by exhaustion or aching hands, or a woman kneeling for 40 minutes with pins between her lips. Edith's genuine mastery included, as a quiet, unspoken requirement, the mastery of appearing to have expended no visible effort at all, and that specific kind of labor, the labor of making labor invisible, deserves to be counted among everything else she accomplished today. It is worth asking gently how many trades still work this way even now, how much of what looks effortless in any life, a well-run household, a smoothly delivered meal, a calm face on a hard day, rests on someone's careful, hidden effort to keep the strain from showing. The fifth pattern concerns the mediated nature, nearly every relationship inside this trade. Edith knew her clients intimately in one narrow sense. Their exact measurements, the specific asymmetries of their shoulders, their private preferences about how tightly a bodice should sit. And yet, in every other sense that might ordinarily constitute knowing another person, she knew almost nothing of them at all, and they knew still less of her. Mrs. Bramwell Hoyt would wear her mended gown to a garden party this weekend, without ever learning the name of the woman who had saved it from ruin. The relationship between the two of them existed entirely through the medium of the garment itself, warm and human on one side of the transaction, almost entirely abstract on the other, a closeness that was, in the end, no closeness at all. The sixth and final pattern is perhaps the gentlest, and the one Edith herself would likely recognize most readily if anyone asked her to name it. It is the durable satisfaction of a trade genuinely mastered, regardless of how narrowly the world around it chose to reward that mastery. The pride she felt in a perfectly finished seam, in a room properly swept and put to rest, in a wedding gown's bodice built to hold its shape for decades after the wedding day itself had faded from memory, was real, was hers entirely, and belonged to no one else, no matter how little credit the wider world was inclined to offer for it. There is something worth sitting with in that. A life can be dense with obligation, can rest on labor the world barely notices, and can still contain, within all of that, a genuine and sustaining dignity that no client's careless indifference could ever quite take away. It is nearly 7 o'clock now, and the street outside has gone fully dark, the gas lamps burning steady gold against the sky, gone the deep blue of true evening. Edith climbs the narrow back stairs to her own small room above the workroom, and the sounds of the day, the shears, the sewing machine, the low murmur of a dozen women's voices, have given way entirely to a stillness broken only by the faint creak of the stairs beneath her feet, and somewhere below in the street, the distant clop of a single late carriage making its way home. Her room is small, but entirely her own. A narrow bed against one wall, a chest of drawers, the small table beside her bed where the battered novel from her sister waits in its drawer, and a compact, iron stove that she lights now with the same practiced ease she brought to the workroom stove 12 hours earlier, meant only to take the evening chill off a single small room rather than warm a working space full of women and silk. She sits on the edge of her bed and begins finally to unlace her boots, her fingers working the small buttons and laces loose with the relief that only comes at the true end of a long day's standing, and sets them beside the door where she will find them again in the morning. There is a small cotton nightgown, washed soft, with years of use, folded on top of her chest of drawers, and she changes into it slowly, letting the day's last tension ease out of her shoulders as she does. Downstairs, on a small shelf near her stove, she keeps a little milk and a tin of grated nutmeg, and tonight, as on most nights, she warms a cup of milk over the stove's low flame, stirring in a pinch of the nutmeg until the whole small room fills with its warm, faintly sweet scent. She drinks it slowly, sitting on the edge of her bed, and somewhere in the middle of the cup she notices, for the first time all day, the sound of rain beginning against the roof slates just above her ceiling. A soft, steady patter that will likely continue through the night and leave the street outside washed clean and quiet by morning. The neighborhood settles into its own nighttime hush around her. A dog barks once, twice somewhere, several streets over, and falls silent. A late cart passes below, its wheels slow on the wet cobbles. The rain continues its steady patter against the roof, and Edith, her cup finished and set aside, allows her tired fingers, which have held pins and needles and shears in careful, controlled tension for 12 straight hours, to finally, fully unclench. She flexes them slowly, one at a time, an old habit that eases the day's accumulated stiffness a little before sleep, and closes her eyes for a moment, simply to feel the stillness of a body that has, at last, nothing more expected of it. She reaches for the drawer beside her bed and lifts out the worn novel, opening it not to the beginning, but to wherever the ribbon marker happens to fall, and reads 2 pages by the small candle she has lit for exactly this purpose, her eyes moving slowly over words she has read perhaps 30 times before, taking comfort not in surprise, but in the opposite of it, in the familiar and the known and the entirely predictable, which is, on a night like this one, exactly the kind of comfort her whole aching body is asking for. Beyond her small window, the street has settled into the deep hush that only falls over a city neighborhood, well after its shops have closed and before its earliest workers have risen again. A church clock somewhere to the east strikes the half hour, faint and unhurried, and Edith counts it without quite meaning to, an old habit from childhood nights in Bermondsey, when the striking of a distant clock. She thinks, briefly and without any real sadness, of her sister across the ocean, of her mother's failing eyes in the old room south of the river, of Louisa already asleep by now in her own lodgings a short walk away, of Mrs. Pryke's ledgers and Mrs. Ashby Reeves' careful accounts, and the whole quiet machinery of obligation that will start turning again in barely 12 hours' time. None of it troubles her tonight. It is simply the shape of her life, familiar and considerable, and, in its own understated way, entirely her own. Downstairs, in the workroom, she has just put so carefully to rest. The shrouded dress forms stand silent beneath their cotton sheets, the last of the gaslight burning low and gentle. Tomorrow's work waiting patiently on the cutting table exactly where she left it. The wedding commission's bodice pieces, basted loosely and safely for the night. The garden party dress, already delivered, already admired by a woman who will likely never learn the name of the hand that mended its pulling seam. Miss Farrer's court presentation gown, waiting for one final fitting before it carries a young woman into a throne room in a fortnight's time. Tomorrow already exists in outline, in the private notebook on Edith's own small table, waiting to begin again almost before tonight has finished. That is the nature of a life built around other people's calendars. The day begins again before it has quite finished the day before it. But that belongs to tomorrow, and tomorrow can wait a few more hours yet. For now, the candle gutters low, and Edith closes her book and sets it back in its drawer and blows out the flame. The rain continues softly against the roof slates above her. Somewhere below, the workroom holds its quiet, orderly rest. Everything in its proper place, ready for whatever the next day will ask of it. And here, in this small, warm room, above a Mayfair dressmaker's shop, in the spring of 1905, a woman named Edith Marsh, who gave her whole considerable skill to garments other people would wear and largely forget, finally allows herself to close her eyes. Wherever you are tonight, whatever hour has found you listening to this, I hope this was good company. There is something quietly worth having in an evening spent inside someone else's ordinary, hard-working life, a life that mattered enormously to the person living it, even though history rarely paused to record it properly. Edith Marsh, in every particular that counts, was real, multiplied across hundreds of women like her in workrooms across a city that has long since changed beyond her recognizing. Their hands built the beauty an entire era admired and asked, in return, for very little beyond a decent wage and a quiet room to rest in at the end of it. The rain is still falling somewhere over that Mayfair street. If we allow ourselves to imagine it a little longer, soft and steady against dark slate roofs, washing the cobblestones clean for a morning that has not yet arrived. The workroom sleeps. The shears are put away. The mannequins stand covered and still beneath their cotton sheets. And the last low gaslight holds its patient watch over a room that earned every hour of the rest it is finally getting. Sleep well, friend. Let your own hands rest the way hers finally did, and let the rest of tonight simply be quiet.